My daughter Eliza and her husband whispered about a resort for me. But I happened to overhear the truth: a nursing home, the sale of my house, and $890,000. They thought this old man was finished, but they don't know. An old firefighter always knows how to find an escape route when things start to burn. Have you ever felt like a stranger in the house you spent a lifetime building? Hello, my friends. My name is Joel Ward. Thank you for being here with me. Whether you're listening from your garage, the cab of your truck, or that familiar kitchen corner, let me know you're here. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments below. Let's start this story together. That evening was just like any other Tuesday. The low hum of the baseball game on the TV was just background noise, a familiar rhythm to the end of the day. I was settled into my old lazy boy recliner, the one my late wife, Sarah, used to call my throne. The faint, savory scent of roast chicken still hung in the air, a ghost of the dinner we'd shared. My daughters, Eliza and Mason, had already gone to their rooms. Mason had even poked her head out to say, "Get some rest, Dad. You look tired." I thought it was concern. I remember I just smiled and nodded, feeling a quiet warmth spread through my chest. That warmth, looking back on it now, it wasn't the warmth of comfort. It was the warmth of a rising fever, the kind that tells you an illness is about to take hold. I closed my eyes for a moment, just listening to the distant voice of the announcer, and felt a fragile sense of peace. It was the peace of a man who has no idea that just a few feet away, on the other side of a thin wooden door, his entire world was being appraised. Thirst, the thirst of an old man, comes on you suddenly, an urgent, dry demand. I pushed myself up slowly, my knees letting out a soft pop of protest. I started for the kitchen, my bare feet padding across the familiar oak floorboards, a surface worn smooth with the tracks of nearly 40 years. Every step holds a memory in a house like this. As I passed my girls' old room, the one they were sharing again temporarily, I heard whispers. At first, I didn't pay them any mind. But then I caught a single word that snagged in the air. My name. Joel. It was Mason's voice. Then another phrase. The house. I stopped, every nerve suddenly on alert. Their door was cracked open just an inch. It's close to 900,000, Mason. I checked the comps. It's enough for us to get a fresh start somewhere else. That was Eliza. My daughter, Eliza. My heart gave a painful lurch, a skip in the rhythm that had been steady my whole life. But how do we get him to leave? Mason asked. A pause settled in the hallway. I held my breath, my hand flattened against the cool drywall to steady myself. I'll tell him about a high-end retirement community, Eliza answered, her voice sickeningly sweet, a sound I now recognized as the tone she used when she wanted something. A place with 24/7 nursing care. We'll tell him he deserves the rest. That we just can't give him the care he needs anymore. A retirement community. Such a gentle, polished word for a prison. They were talking about a nursing home. They were talking about getting rid of me. Once the paperwork is signed, it'll be easy. He's getting a little confused anyway. No one will question it. He's a burden. Mason. A burden. The word didn't just enter my ear. It was a physical thing, a shard of ice driving straight through my skull. I was no longer their father. I was a liability, an asset to be liquidated. The glass of water I'd been holding slipped from my fingers. By some small miracle, it landed on the soft runner in the hallway, making a dull, muffled thump instead of shattering. But inside me, something had shattered. Something fundamental and irreparable. I backed away, step by silent step, retreating until I was back in the living room. The thirst was gone, replaced by a thick, bitter coating at the back of my throat. I lowered myself into the recliner, sinking into the darkness of the room. The baseball game played on, bright and loud and meaningless. A different universe where betrayal didn't exist. I sat there, completely still. I don't know for how long. An hour? 2? All I know is that when I finally looked toward the window, the streetlights had flickered on, casting long, pale yellow stripes across the floor where my children used to play. The numbness, the paralysis, it eventually began to recede. And in its place, a cold anger started to build. Confused? I wasn't confused. I could remember the name of the contractor who helped me frame this house in 1985. A burden? I'd never asked my children for a dime. In fact, I'd paid for Mason's car repairs just last week and covered their fancy dinner out over the weekend. My anger wasn't hot or loud. It didn't make me want to scream. It was a quiet, deep, clarifying fire. It made my mind feel sharper than it had in years. They thought I was a doddering old fool, a piece of inventory waiting to be cleared. They had made a terrible mistake. I didn't storm down the hall. I didn't confront them. I knew instinctively that it would be useless. You can't reason with vultures who are just waiting for you to die. Instead, my eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, to the silver-framed photo of Sarah and me on our wedding day. What would she say if she were here? I knew exactly what she'd say. Her voice was as clear in my head as if she were standing right beside me. Don't you let them walk all over you, Joel. And so, that night, in the profound silence of the home I had built with my own 2 hands, I made a decision. I would not let them turn me into a statistic. I would not let them cash me out like a winning lottery ticket. And I would not, under any circumstances, let them take the last thing I had left. My dignity. The war hadn't started yet, but I already knew my first move. The sun came up, but my world stayed dark. I woke up slumped in the lazy boy, a sharp, angry crick in my neck. Outside the window, the birds started their morning chorus, a cheerful sound that felt like a personal insult. I could hear the floorboards creak upstairs, the sound of water running through the old pipes. Eliza and Mason. Soon they would come down, armed with their fake smiles and hollow, scripted questions. Did you sleep well, Dad? I could already hear the words, could picture the careful, practiced look of concern. Everything in this house, every familiar sound and shadow was now tainted. The creak of the floorboards under their feet was no longer the sound of family. It was the sound of predators pacing their territory. I sat perfectly still, listening and waiting for the play to begin. Eliza came down first, already dressed in expensive-looking running gear that I'm sure I paid for. "Morning, Dad," she chirped, her voice bright and utterly false. "Want me to make some coffee?" I just nodded, not trusting my own voice. She breezed past me into the kitchen, her movements light and carefree, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't sentenced me to exile the night before. She poured a mug of coffee, the dark liquid steaming, and set it on the end table beside me. "You seemed really tired last night. You need to get more rest." There it was, the opening line of the second act. Her words from the hallway echoed in my head. Tell him he deserves the rest. Every syllable of concern was now a twist of the knife. I took a sip of the coffee. It tasted more bitter than usual. Mason came down a few moments later, said nothing, just gave me a slight nod as she buried her face in her phone. Her silent, casual indifference was somehow worse than Eliza's elaborate lies. One was an active betrayal, the other a complete erasure. After they both left for their day, Eliza to the gym, Mason to meet a friend, I waited for the sound of their cars to fade down the street. Then I began to walk through my house. This wasn't a morning stroll. This was an investigation. My own private crime scene. I started in the kitchen. I opened the heavy door of the refrigerator, its hum suddenly sounding like a low growl. The shelves were packed with organic produce, bottles of kombucha, expensive cold-pressed juices that I would never touch. The weekly grocery bill, which I always paid without a second glance, flashed in my mind. I was funding a lifestyle I didn't even participate in. I went down to the basement. The brand-new, top-of-the-line washer and dryer set stood gleaming in the corner. Mason had insisted on them last month, telling me the old ones were inefficient and that a new set would be good for you, Dad. I remembered the $2,000 charge on my credit card. From there, I walked out to the garage. Mason's old BMW was parked next to my Ford F-150, my truck, bought and paid for with 20 years of sweat, her car, a constant drain. I thought about last week, when I'd handed her $500 in cash for a brake job. I had seen it as a father's duty. Now I saw the truth. I wasn't a father anymore. I was an ATM. I came back inside and stood before the closed door to their room. For the first time in 40 years, I felt like a trespasser in my own home. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. I could picture the inside perfectly. Piles of designer clothes, the newest phones and tablets, a whole world built on my silence and my money. They lived here for free. They ate the food I bought. They used the electricity and water I paid for, and they had the audacity to call me a burden. The sheer, staggering absurdity of it all made a sound bubble up from my chest. It was a laugh, a dry, ragged, humorless bark of a laugh that offered no relief. I retreated to the living room, my sanctuary, which now felt like a holding cell. My eyes landed on Sarah's old piano in the corner. Eliza used to love to play. Sarah had sat with her on that bench for hours, teaching her how to read music, guiding her small fingers over the keys. When was the last time Eliza had touched it? It had to be years. A thin, uniform layer of dust covered the lid. I ran my finger across the surface, leaving a clean, dark streak in the gray film. This was their inheritance. Not the house, not the money in my savings account. It was the memory of their mother's hands, the lessons she taught, the love she poured into them. But they'd forgotten. They had traded that priceless legacy for one that could be listed, appraised, and sold to the highest bidder. I crossed to the small desk by the window and pulled open a drawer. I took out a thick folder of old bills, Sarah's medical expenses from her final year, the receipts for the new roof after the big hailstorm, Eliza's tuition bills from college. Every single piece of paper represented a sacrifice, a choice I had made to provide for my family. I laid a few of them out on the coffee table. Then I picked up the real estate magazine Mason had left there. It was still open to the page she'd been looking at, a picture of a sleek modern house circled in red ink. The past and the future laid out side by side. On one side, a history of giving. On the other, a blueprint for taking. The contrast was brutal, absolute. And in that moment, looking at the life I had built versus the life they were planning, I had a revelation. Losing this house to them wouldn't be a tragedy. It would be an escape. It would be my liberation. You know, sometimes the greatest sacrifices we make are met with the quietest indifference. Have you ever looked back and realized you've been giving so much of yourself that you've forgotten to save any for you? Share your story in the comments below. I'm listening. I had to get out of the house. It felt contaminated. Every room a stage for a play I never knew I was in. I retreated to the only sanctuary I had left, the garage. The heavy door rumbled down behind me, and the sudden silence was a relief. The familiar smell of cold metal, motor oil, and sawdust has always had a calming effect on me. It's a place of logic, of order. Everything in here has a purpose, a function. The tools hang on the pegboard in neat silver outlines. The workbench is cluttered but organized. Nothing pretends to be something it's not, unlike the world on the other side of that door. My eyes fell on the old fire axe mounted on the wall. It was from my first year on the force, a decommissioned piece I'd restored myself. The steel head was polished to a mirror shine, the hickory handle dark and smooth with linseed oil. Captain Miller had handed it to me himself, telling me it had seen more action than most of the rookies. It no longer served in battling blazes, but it still served as a symbol of a life spent protecting others, a life spent running into danger when everyone else was running out. I reached out and laid my palm flat against the cold, heavy steel. The weight of it felt familiar, grounding. I used to be that man. A memory surfaced, so clear it felt like yesterday. Eliza was about 7 or 8 years old, wearing yellow pajamas with little ducks on them. One evening, I got the whole family together for a fire drill. I can still feel her small, trusting hand in mine as I showed her how to check the smoke detectors, how to feel a door for heat with the back of her hand. I walked her through the safest escape route from her bedroom window to the old oak tree in the front yard. "You always have to have a plan, sweetheart," I told her, kneeling down to look her in the eye. "You always have to know the way out." The irony is a bitter pill to swallow. I spent my life teaching my daughter how to escape a burning building, but I never thought I'd have to teach her not to be the one holding the match. She forgot the most important lesson of all. You never, ever set fire to your own home. Then, Sarah's face appeared in my mind. The memory of her last days in the hospice wing, the antiseptic smell of the room, the relentless, gentle beeping of the machines that were failing to keep her here. She held my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Her eyes, tired and clouded with pain, were still filled with a fierce, unwavering trust. "Promise me, Joel," she'd whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Promise me you'll always be Eliza's protector. She needs you." And I promised. Standing in that sterile room that smelled of death and disinfectant, I swore I would be her shield, her fortress wall. Now, that same shield has to be turned inward to protect myself from the very person I swore to defend. A wave of guilt washed over me, cold and heavy. "I'm failing you, Sarah. I'm about to break the most sacred promise I ever made." But then another thought rose to the surface, hard and clear, cutting through the grief. Maybe protecting Eliza also meant protecting her from herself. Maybe the real promise wasn't just to keep her safe, but to make sure she grew into a person worthy of that safety. Maybe the most loving thing a father can do is to teach his child that there are consequences. The memories kept coming, each one now tinged with poison. Eliza and Mason's wedding day. I'd smiled through the whole ceremony, my chest puffed out with pride as I walked her down the aisle. I remembered writing the checks for the venue, the flowers, the band, never thinking twice about the cost. I just wanted them to have a perfect start, a solid foundation to build their life on. I thought of it as an investment in their happiness. I didn't realize I was laying the first brick in a wall of their dependency. I was giving them the fish instead of teaching them how to fish. And now, all these years later, they didn't just want the fish, they wanted the whole damn lake, and they were ready to drain it dry. When she was a little girl, Eliza used to brag to her friends, her eyes shining with pride. "My daddy's a fireman. He's a hero." She drew pictures of me, scribbled in crayon, always standing in front of a big red fire engine with a lopsided ladder. What happened to those drawings? Tucked away in an attic? Or were they thrown out long ago with the rest of her childhood toys, artifacts from a time when I was worth more than the equity in my house? I had gone from being her hero to her father, to an old man, and finally, to a burden. That demotion didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, quiet erosion, a gradual stripping away of value that, blinded by love, I had failed to see. I sank down onto an old wooden crate in the corner of the garage, the rough wood pressing into my legs. The pain was different now. It was no longer the dull shock of a blunt force trauma. It was sharp, specific, and clear. I finally understood. All my sacrifices, all my love, all the years of putting them first, it hadn't been forgotten. It was worse than that. It had been remembered. It had been meticulously cataloged, recorded not as acts of love, but as assets. An inventory of my life's work, tallied up as their rightful inheritance. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were foreclosing on my life while I was still living it. My love wasn't a gift. It was a down payment. A new heat rose in my chest. It wasn't the wild, chaotic anger of a wildfire. It was the deep, contained, searing heat of a forge, the kind that's hot enough to burn away impurities and temper iron into steel. My resolve hardened. My purpose became clear. It was time. It was time to put out this fire. The next morning, I didn't sit in the dark. I didn't wait for the hollow charade of their good mornings. Instead, I went straight to the garage. There was a job to do. I'd been putting off a deep clean for months, maybe years, always finding an excuse, but today it felt like the only thing that made sense. I pulled the chain for the overhead light, and as the fluorescent bulb flickered to life, I started to work. I began to organize my tools, a lifetime of them. Wrenches into one drawer, sockets clicked into their plastic rails, pliers onto the pegboard, screwdrivers into another. Each tool, wiped clean of grease and dust, was returned to its proper place. This physical act of imposing order on the chaos of my workbench was a mirror for what was happening in my mind. With every rusted bolt I threw into the trash, I felt like I was discarding a piece of useless self-pity. With every sharp blade I wiped down, I was honing my own resolve. I was throwing out the junk, the guilt, the second-guessing, the raw, useless pain, and keeping only what was sharp, what was effective. It was hard, physical work, and with every drop of sweat, I felt a little more of their poison leaving my system. A new order was being established, inside and out. A clear, cold thought was finally taking shape. As I was cleaning a pair of old vice grips, I caught my distorted reflection in the polished chrome. But for the first time in days, I looked into the eyes of that reflection, and I didn't see confusion. I didn't see a victim. I was no longer asking myself, where did I go wrong? The answer was clear. I hadn't. I had done my job. I was a father, and I had loved and provided for my children with every fiber of my being. This wasn't my failure. This was their choice. This was a reflection of their character, not a verdict on mine. The moment I truly accepted that, the crushing weight of blame I'd placed on my own shoulders simply evaporated. It was a physical feeling, a loosening in my back and neck, the ability to take a full, deep breath. I wasn't a victim in a tragedy they had written. I was a survivor, and it was time for me to find my own way out of the wreckage. I stopped working, my hands resting on the cool surface of the workbench. I looked at the interior wall, the simple barrier of drywall and studs that separated the garage from the house. On the other side of that wall were my daughter and her husband. They were in my house, eating my food, planning to take everything from me because they saw me as a burden, because they wanted me gone. An idea sparked in my mind, not born of rage or a desire for revenge, but of a simple, undeniable truth. All right, I thought. If I'm a burden, then I'll do you a favor. I'll lift myself out of your lives. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was just a decision. A quiet, final decision about how and where I would live the rest of my own life. I walked out of the garage and into the house, heading straight for the small desk in the corner of the den. I could hear the television droning on in the living room where Mason was watching some morning show. I ignored it, filtering it out like meaningless static. I opened the drawer and pulled out a fresh notebook, a hardcover logbook just like the ones we used at the station to record shift changes and equipment checks. The smell of clean, crisp paper was comforting. I picked up a simple ballpoint pen. In the quiet of the room, the sharp click as I pressed the button on top sounded as loud and final as a gavel. It was the starting gun. Then I wrote the first line. My hand, to my surprise, was perfectly steady. The letters were firm, clear, and certain. To do. 1. Find a real estate agent. Must be discreet. Line by line, the list began to grow. This wasn't a plan of attack. It was a checklist for a strategic relocation, a procedure. I was just following the steps, the way we'd check our gear before leaving the firehouse for a call. 2. Contact a lawyer, inquire about legal rights. 3. Open new bank account, different bank. 4. Research small, one-bedroom apartments for rent, near a bus line. I wasn't thinking about how it felt. I was only thinking about what had to be done next. Logic, necessity, action. Emotion is a luxury when you're in the business of saving your own life. When the first page was full of neat, bullet-pointed tasks, I leaned back in my chair. The anger and the pain were still there, somewhere in the background, but they had been put aside. They were no longer in command. In their place was a profound and welcome clarity, a focus. It was the same feeling I used to get in the moments before the alarm bell went off at the station, that quiet, focused calm. You don't know how big the fire is going to be, but you know your job. You know the procedure. I looked down at the list, at the clear black ink on the white page. It was my escape route. I knew this was the beginning of a long, hard journey, but for the first time in a long time, I was the one driving. That list I'd written sat on my desk, the black ink a testament to my new resolve. But there's a different kind of weight that no pen can write down, a burden that settles deep in your gut. It's the voice of doubt, that quiet, nagging whisper in the back of your mind that asks, "Are you sure about this? Are you doing the right thing? Aren't you being too hard on them?" After a lifetime of protecting my family, the idea of acting against them felt unnatural, like trying to walk backward. I needed to talk to someone, not to confess everything, not to unload my problems, but just to hear another voice, to get a perspective from outside the four walls of my own head. My first thought was Dave. We'd served at the same firehouse for 30 years. We'd seen each other through promotions, injuries, and the births of our children. Dave's a man of few words, but the ones he chooses always count. He's the kind of man who understands the weight of responsibility without you ever having to explain it. If anyone could understand, it was him. I gave him a call, and we agreed to meet at the Blue Plate Diner, the old greasy spoon we used to hit after a long shift. The smell of frying bacon and strong black coffee still has a way of soothing the nerves. We slid into our usual corner booth, the red vinyl cracked and worn in all the familiar places. For a few minutes we just sat there, making small talk about the weather, about his grandkids. But I didn't know how to start. You see, a man's pride is a stubborn thing. It's hard to find the words to say, "My own kids are trying to throw me out of my house." So instead, I came at it sideways. I stirred my coffee, watching the black liquid swirl. "Hey, Dave," I said, trying to sound casual. "You ever think about getting your papers in order for the kids? The house and all that? Seems like they get in a hurry sometimes, you know? A man's got to be careful." I kept my eyes on my coffee cup, but I could feel his gaze on me. Dave took a slow sip from his thick ceramic mug. He set it down with a deliberate click and looked at me for a long moment. "Careful is the right word, Joel," he said, his voice as low and steady as ever. "But being careful doesn't mean handing everything over. My own son was asking about power of attorney last week. I told him, the day I can't make my own decisions is the day we'll talk about it. Today is not that day." He leaned forward slightly. "It's your house, Joel, your money. You're the one who makes the final decision. That's your right." He had no idea what was really happening in my life. He didn't know about the whispers, the lies, the plan, but every word he spoke was a confirmation, a validation of the cold resolve that had been forming in my gut. "That's your right." That simple phrase lifted half the weight off my shoulders. It wasn't me being bitter or cruel. It was me exercising my right to exist, to have control over the life I had built. After that cup of coffee with Dave, the doubt was gone. I knew I was on the right path. That afternoon, I sat at my desk, took a deep breath, and made the first real call from my list. I'd looked up real estate agencies online, skipping the big national chains and finding a smaller, local, family-owned firm. The kind of place that seemed discreet. A woman with a professional, kind voice answered the phone. "Good afternoon, Thompson Realty." "Hello," I said, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. "My name is Joel Ward. I was calling to ask about getting an appraisal on a property." I forced my voice to stay calm, even as my pulse hammered in my ears. The first step, the first real move in this new war, had been made. A few days later, I had a meeting with the agent. Her name was Brenda. I arranged to meet her at a coffee shop a few towns over. I had to lie to Eliza and Mason, telling them I had a dental appointment. The feeling of having to sneak around in my own life to lie about where I was going was a bitter pill to swallow. Brenda was sharp. She must have seen the anxiety on my face as I sat down. "Mr. Ward," she said gently, "please don't you worry. Everything we discuss is completely confidential. How can I help you get started?" Her professionalism, the simple respect in her voice, was a relief. It was something I hadn't realized how much I'd been missing. I gave her my address. "For now, I just want to know its value," I said. "And I need to know how a sale could be handled, as quickly and as quietly as possible." Brenda called me back 2 days later. I saw her name on the caller ID and had to step out into the backyard to answer, my back to the house. "Mr. Ward," she said, I've run the comparisons based on recent sales in your neighborhood. A conservative estimate for your property's value would be right around $890,000. $890,000. I'd heard the number before, whispered from my daughter's lips. But hearing it stated as a fact from a professional made my head spin. That wasn't a number. It was 40 years of mortgage payments. It was the new roof after the hailstorm. It was a lifetime. And Mr. Ward, Brenda added, the market is very strong right now. If you do decide to sell, I'm confident we could have it closed very quickly. I thanked her and hung up the phone. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the garden Sarah had planted all those years ago. The number, $890,000, was no longer the inheritance my children were trying to steal. It had just become my ticket to freedom. Brenda, the real estate agent, was ready. She had the listing agreement drawn up, a simple contract that held the weight of my entire future. The problem, I quickly realized, wasn't the decision. It was the execution. I needed to sign it. And I needed to do it without Eliza or Mason having the slightest clue. This was harder than it sounded. Every day they were just there, drifting through the house like ghosts who hadn't yet realized they were haunting the place. They had no jobs to go to, no pressing appointments. They just existed within these walls, a constant, watchful presence. Brenda had suggested sending the documents by courier, but I shot that down immediately. They checked the mail every day, a habit they'd picked up waiting for online shopping deliveries. She offered a meeting at her office, but how could I explain being gone for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day? A dental appointment was one thing. A multi-hour disappearance was another. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, every move scrutinized, every action questioned. That ticket to freedom felt impossibly far away, locked in a safe I couldn't get to. But then, as I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at the weekly calendar where Sarah used to write everything down, it hit me. I'd been so focused on their presence that I'd forgotten about their patterns, their habits. Mason had her hot yoga class every Thursday morning at 9 sharp, and Eliza, like clockwork, would go shopping immediately after, a ritual she called her retail therapy. It was a window, a small, 2-hour window of opportunity carved out of an otherwise locked-down schedule, a gap in their surveillance. My heart started to thud against my ribs. I picked up my phone and called Brenda. "Thursday morning," I said, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. 10 o'clock. Can you meet me at a coffee shop near my house? I'll only have about an hour, maybe less. I'm sure she could hear the strain in my voice, but she was a true professional. "Of course, Mr. Ward," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. 10 o'clock, the Daily Grind on Elm Street. I'll be there. Thursday morning arrived, thick with a tension only I could feel. I went through the motions of my normal routine, forcing myself to move slowly, deliberately. I made breakfast. I sat at the table and turned the pages of the newspaper, not reading a single word. When Mason came down, yoga mat tucked under her arm, I just gave a slight nod. When Eliza asked, "Need me to pick anything up for you, Dad?" I shook my head, my voice surprisingly steady. "No, sweetheart. I've got everything I need." Inside, my heart was running a marathon. The moment Eliza's car cleared the end of the driveway, my mission began. I grabbed my jacket, snatched the keys to my old truck, and was out the door in less than a minute. It felt like one of those rescue operations from the old days, a mad dash into a dangerous situation. The only difference was, the person I was rescuing was myself. I drove to the coffee shop, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see their car behind me. Brenda was already there, sitting at a small table in the back. She had a file folder open, and the sight of those official documents made my stomach clench. "Mr. Ward," she said with a calm smile as I sat down, "please, take your time and read through everything." She pushed the papers toward me. It was a sea of dense, legal text, but my eyes were only searching for one thing. There it was, a single blank line next to my typed name, Joel Ward. I picked up the pen she offered. My hand was trembling, just slightly. This was it, the point of no return. Signing this paper would set in motion a series of events I couldn't take back. I took a deep, steadying breath, the rich, dark smell of roasting coffee filling my lungs. And then I signed my name, a firm, decisive signature. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, an incredible, powerful wave of relief washed over me. The weight of the house, the weight of my indecision, the weight of their betrayal, it all seemed to lift, absorbed into that small line of blue ink. "All done," Brenda said, sliding the contract back into the folder. "Now the work begins. And don't you worry, we won't be putting a for sale sign on your lawn. We'll start by marketing this through private channels to pre-qualified buyers." That was a load off my mind. I didn't want them to know. Not yet. I wanted the pieces in place before they even knew a storm was coming. We quickly discussed the details. She would only schedule viewings when I called and gave her an all clear, and all our communication would go through a prepaid burner phone, which I would buy that afternoon. I pulled into the garage just as Eliza's car was turning into the driveway. The timing was so close it made my heart hammer against my ribs all over again. I forced my face into a neutral expression as I walked into the house, just as she was coming through the door, arms loaded with shopping bags from high-end stores. "I got some amazing deals, Dad," she announced, oblivious. I just nodded. "That's nice, dear." She had no idea that while she was bargain hunting, I had just signed away the very future she was banking on. I sat down in my lazy boy, the old familiar throne, but something had fundamentally changed. This house, it didn't feel like it was completely mine anymore. It had become something else. It had become a stage, and the final act was about to begin. A few strange weeks went by. On my end, Brenda was quietly working, a ghost in the machine, sending me brief coded updates on my burner phone. I was living in a state of constant low-grade tension, like a wire pulled too tight. Every time the phone rang, every time a car slowed down on our street, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. The strange part, though, was them. Eliza and Mason. They became nice. Unusually nice. Eliza started asking if I wanted to watch one of my old war movies with her. Mason would make a point of asking how my day was. This sudden display of affection didn't warm my heart. It chilled me to the bone, because I knew what it was. It was a tactic. We were taught it at the academy. One of the most dangerous signs, right before a structure fire leads to a catastrophic collapse, is a sudden, eerie quiet. The groaning of stressed materials stops. The roar of the fire seems to pull back. That's the moment you get out, because it means the whole thing is about to come down. They were trying to soothe the structure, to quiet the groaning, right before they pulled the last pin. They were getting ready for their final move. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was tidying up the living room, mostly just moving things around to keep my hands busy, when I saw it. Mason's tablet, left on the coffee table. This was unusual. That device was practically glued to her hand. She must have been in a real hurry to leave it behind. My first thought, the old fatherly instinct, was to take it up to her room for safekeeping. But as I picked it up, the screen lit up with a touch. A web page was still open. And there it was, in cheerful, sunny letters. Golden Meadows Retirement Resort. My heart seized. The resort, the name Eliza had whispered in the hallway. A morbid curiosity, too strong to resist, took over. I sat down in my recliner, the tablet feeling alien and cold in my hands, and I started to read. It was exactly what you'd expect. The website was a masterpiece of marketing. Pictures of silver-haired seniors smiling as they played chess in a sun-drenched garden. Photos of a gentle-looking nurse helping a woman with her knitting. There were testimonials praising the dedicated 24/7 care, the vibrant and friendly community, the promise of a well-deserved, worry-free retirement. Everything was polished to a perfect, sterile shine. But to me, the smiles on those faces looked hollow. The pleasant, cream-colored walls of the rooms looked like the walls of a cage. This wasn't a home. This was a waiting room. A polite, expensive place to be forgotten. I kept scrolling, my finger tracing down the glossy page until I found the link I was looking for. Tuition and fees. The numbers that appeared on the screen made me catch my breath. Thousands of dollars a month, tens of thousands a year. An astronomical sum. A cold, practical question cut through the shock. How on earth could Eliza and Mason afford this? They lived in my house rent-free. And then, like the last piece of a sickening puzzle clicking into place, I understood. They weren't going to pay for it. I was. They were going to use the money from the sale of this house. The plan unspooled in my mind, hideously clear. Sell the house. Take the nearly $900,000. Use a fraction of it to pay the first few months at Golden Meadows, just enough to make the whole thing look legitimate. And then, once I was out of sight and out of mind, they would leave me there, locked away, while they walked away with the rest of my life's savings. I almost closed it then. I'd seen enough. But my thumb brushed the top of the screen, and I saw that another tab was open behind the website. It was her email, and the subject line of the topmost message read, "Plan for Dad." I felt the blood drain from my face. I tapped it open. It was an email from Eliza to Mason. I read the words, and the world seemed to fall away. Checked out Golden Meadows online. Looks good. We can frame it as a gift for him, a surprise. Once he's settled in and we have power of attorney, the house sale will be no problem. The lawyer said the key is getting a doctor's signature on the paperwork, just to confirm he's no longer of sound mind. No longer of sound mind. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the house. They were going to strip me of my own mind, my own legal identity. They were going to have me declared incompetent, a man who couldn't be trusted to make his own decisions, all to make their theft easier. I closed the tablet. With a steady hand, I placed it back on the coffee table, right where I'd found it. I didn't delete the email. I didn't clear the browser history. I left the evidence just as it was. I sat back in my chair, in the total silence of the living room. Any last lingering shred of hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that I had been too harsh, it was all gone, annihilated. This wasn't a mistake. This was a conspiracy, cold and calculated. This betrayal was deeper and darker than anything I could have ever imagined. The anger rose in me then, but it wasn't hot. It didn't make me want to scream or break things. It was a silent, profound, and absolute cold, the kind of cold that freezes water into solid, unyielding ice. Every doubt was gone. I knew, with a certainty that settled into my very bones, that I was doing the right thing, and I would not stop. I had the proof now, cold and hard on a digital screen. I had the resolve, forged in the quiet heat of my garage. But I knew, with the certainty of a man who has walked into burning buildings, that you don't fight a fire you don't understand. And I was standing at the edge of a strange and unfamiliar territory. The law, I imagined, was like a dense, dark forest full of tangled roots and hidden pitfalls, and I needed a guide. I needed someone who knew the terrain. Fighting on your own is one thing. Fighting smart is another. I couldn't afford a single foolish mistake. The line item in my notebook, "Contact a lawyer," was no longer just a task. It was my lifeline. I didn't need the most expensive, sharpest-suited attorney in the city. I needed someone who understood, someone who'd seen a story like mine before. I went online again, sitting at the small desk that now felt like my command center. This time, my search was specific. I typed in the words, "elder law attorney." A list of names appeared. I scrolled past the large corporate-looking firms with their flashy websites. I was looking for something else. I found it in a small independent practice. The website was simple, and the photo showed a man who looked to be about my age, with kind, intelligent eyes behind a pair of thick glasses. His name was Arthur Weinberg. Taking a deep breath, I picked up my burner phone and dialed the number. A secretary with a gentle voice answered. "Mr. Weinberg's office." I cleared my throat. "Yes, I'd like to schedule a consultation with Mr. Weinberg. It's regarding some estate planning." The lie came easier this time. It wasn't born of shame or fear anymore. It was a strategic move. I was protecting my flank. Arthur's office was on a quiet, tree-lined street downtown. It wasn't glamorous or intimidating. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by the comforting smell of old paper and polished wood. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with thick, leather-bound legal volumes lined the walls. It felt solid, trustworthy. Arthur Weinberg himself was a little older than me, with a full head of white hair and the same kind eyes from the picture. He stood up from behind a large oak desk and shook my hand with a firm, dry grip. "Mr. Ward, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat. Can I get you some coffee? Tea?" The simple, decent courtesy of it all made a knot of tension in my shoulders begin to unwind. I thought it would be hard to say the words, to lay out the ugly truth of my own family. But when Arthur sat back down, folded his hands on his desk and asked, "So, how can I help you?" the story just came out. It wasn't the emotional, rambling mess I had feared. I told it the way I would have filed an incident report back at the station. Clear, factual, chronological. I told him about the whispers in the hallway. I told him about the forgotten tablet and the retirement home's website. I told him about the email, quoting the key phrases from memory. I didn't use words like betrayal or heartbreak. I just presented the facts. Through it all, Arthur listened. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded occasionally, his eyes never leaving mine, making quiet, careful notes in a yellow legal pad. When I finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Arthur leaned back in his chair, looking at me for a long moment. Then, he looked me straight in the eye and spoke. "Mr. Ward," he said, his voice calm and measured, "what you're describing isn't just bad behavior. Legally, what you have here are the clear markers of emotional abuse and a conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. You did absolutely the right thing by coming here." Hearing an expert, a professional, say those words, it had a different kind of weight. It was like he had reached into my private hell and given it a name, a definition. It was no longer just my personal, secret pain. It was a recognized offense, a crime, something the law had a name for, and if it had a name, it had a countermove. For the first time in all these weeks, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Arthur then laid out the next steps, not in complicated legal jargon, but in a clear, simple plan I could understand. "The first and most important thing," he said, leaning forward, "is to protect your assets. The sale of your house is perfectly legal. It is your property, in your name. We will ensure the proceeds from that sale are deposited into a new, protected trust account that you, and only you, can control. We will also immediately draft a new, durable power of attorney, designating someone you trust implicitly, a friend like your Mr. Dave perhaps, or a professional fiduciary, to act on your behalf only if and when you are truly unable to." He gave me a clear path forward. He showed me the escape route, and he assured me it was protected by the full force of the law. I walked out of Arthur Weinberg's office feeling lighter than I had in months. The storm was still out there, I knew that. But now, for the first time, I had a safe, solid shelter to see me through it. You know, sometimes the hardest step to take is the one toward someone else's door to ask for help. But as you can see, finding a professional who will listen, who will validate what you're going through, it can change everything. Have you, or someone you know, ever had to seek out legal advice to protect your rights? Sharing your experience might just give someone else the courage they need to make that call. The call came when I was in the parking lot of the grocery store, sitting in my truck. For a moment, I just stared at the unfamiliar number buzzing on the screen of the burner phone I'd hidden in the glove compartment. It was Brenda. I took a breath before answering, my heart giving a familiar nervous thump. "Mr. Ward, I have good news," she said, and I could hear the genuine excitement in her voice. It was a warmth I wasn't used to hearing anymore. "We have an offer on the house, a very strong one. A young family. They fell in love with it. They've offered the full asking price." I leaned my head back against the worn headrest. It felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. So soon? I'd been preparing for a long, drawn-out process. Weeks, maybe months of secret showings and close calls. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice coming out as a dry croak. "The husband is a doctor at the community hospital," she explained. "His wife is a third-grade teacher at the elementary school just a few blocks away. They have 2 small children, a boy and a girl. They said the house just felt warm. like a place they could put down real roots. A doctor and a teacher, healers and builders, people who spent their lives giving back to the community, not just taking from it. For some reason, that detail settled deep in my chest. It felt right. It felt like the house had chosen them. "There's something else, Mr. Ward," Brenda continued, her voice a little softer now. "They wrote you a letter. It's a bit unconventional, but they insisted. Would it be all right if I read it to you?" I agreed, my throat suddenly tight. Over the phone, I listened as Brenda's professional voice gave life to the words of a woman I had never met. She wrote that they had been searching for a house for almost a year, that they were beginning to lose hope of finding a place with character, a place that felt solid and safe enough to raise their children. She wrote about the giant oak tree in the backyard, and how she could already picture a tire swing hanging from its strongest branch, could already hear her children's laughter in the summer shade. She wrote about the kitchen, about how the worn spots on the wooden floor weren't flaws, but proof that it had been the heart of a home, a place where she could imagine herself baking cookies on a Sunday morning, just like her own mother used to. She didn't mention the property value, or the square footage, or the investment potential. She wrote about a home, and as I sat there in the cab of my dusty old truck, tears started to well up in my eyes. Because this stranger, this young teacher, she saw it. She saw the soul of the soul my own daughters were blind to. That night was difficult. After accepting the offer, a wave of doubt, cold and heavy, washed over me. I sat in the living room in the dark, just looking around at the shadows and the shapes of the life I had built. Every corner held a memory. That faint scuff on the baseboard was from Eliza's first tricycle ride. The barely visible dent in the wall by the doorway was from a stray baseball thrown by a neighborhood kid 20 years ago. This house wasn't just a collection of rooms, it was the physical archive of my entire life, of my marriage, of my fatherhood. This was everything I had. Was I betraying Sarah's memory by letting it go? Was I throwing away the only real legacy I had to leave behind? I closed my eyes, and I tried to picture Sarah, not the frail woman in the hospital bed, but the real Sarah, the vibrant, laughing Sarah, with a smudge of flour on her cheek and life in her eyes. A memory came back to me, sharp and clear. Our old dishwasher had broken down, and I'd been grumbling about the cost of a new one for a solid week. Sarah had just laughed, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Oh, Joel," she'd said, shaking her head, "it's just a machine. This house is just wood and nails and pipes. The real home, the part that matters, that's what we carry in our hearts. We take that with us, wherever we go." Her voice echoed in my head, as clear and true as if she were sitting right there next to me. A home is what you carry with you. The next morning, the doubt was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. I called Brenda from my truck again. "I accept the offer," I said, and my voice was firm, resolute. "Let's move forward." On her end, Brenda let out a little cheer. But for me, it was a moment of profound, peaceful silence. A door had been closed. An irreversible decision had been made. A strange and wonderful sense of relief settled over me. I wasn't throwing my legacy away. I was entrusting it to someone who deserved it. Life inside the house, on the surface, went on exactly as before. Eliza and Mason were still there, completely oblivious. They drifted through the days in a cloud of self-absorption, complaining about their imaginary jobs, watching their shows, living their parasitic lives. I continued to play my part. I cooked their dinners. I cleaned up their messes. I was the quiet, harmless old man in the corner. But inside, I was living a secret life. I was a man with a powerful, life-altering secret. I knew something they didn't know. I knew that the very foundation under their feet was trembling. The house they were so confidently plotting to steal, the asset they had already spent in their minds, was, in fact, no longer part of their future. And that knowledge, that secret power, it was both terrifying and the most liberating feeling I had ever known. They chose a Sunday evening, right after dinner. It was a classic move, the kind of time families set aside for serious conversations. As I cleared the last of the plates, I felt a shift in the air. The easy, meaningless chatter that usually filled the space died down, replaced by a thick, purposeful silence. "Dad, can you come sit down for a minute? We need to talk to you," Eliza said. Her voice had a carefully rehearsed seriousness to it, a tone she hadn't used with me in years. Mason, sitting on the couch, nodded in agreement, her face a mask of solemn concern. Eliza picked up the remote and clicked off the television. The sudden absence of its noise was jarring, leaving a heavy, expectant quiet in its place. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The curtain was going up. The show I had been waiting for was about to begin. I sat down in my recliner, folding my hands in my lap, and waited. "Dad, we're worried about you," Eliza began, leaning forward. She had managed to conjure a look of profound sadness in her eyes, a performance worthy of an award. "You've just seemed more forgetful lately. Last week you forgot to pick up milk from the store. The other day, you couldn't remember the name of that actor. You know, the one in all your favorite old movies." She laid out her exhibits, these tiny, insignificant moments, and tried to frame them as symptoms of a gathering darkness in my mind. Each one was a lie, or a distortion of the truth. I hadn't forgotten the milk. They'd finished it and never put it on the list. I hadn't forgotten the actor's name. I was just tired of having the same conversation. Mason chimed in, her voice soft and full of feigned panic. "And remember that afternoon you said you were just going out for a bit, and you were gone for hours? We were worried sick, Dad. We almost called the police." She was talking about the day I met with Arthur, the lawyer. I'd been gone for 90 minutes, tops. They were building their case, brick by brick, painting a portrait of me as a man who was losing his grip, a man who couldn't be trusted with his own life anymore. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to hit the deepest, most private fear of any man my age, the fear that you're losing your mind. I felt a hot flash of anger rise up from my chest, so powerful it almost made me flinch. I wanted to shout at them, to list their own sins, to expose their rotten, greedy hearts. But I held it back, squeezing the armrests of my chair until my knuckles turned white. I knew, with absolute clarity, that this was the trap. This was what they wanted. They wanted me to yell, to lose my temper, to act erratically. They were baiting me, so they could turn to each other and say, "See, he can't even control his own emotions anymore." After she felt she'd laid enough groundwork, seeded enough doubt, Eliza moved in with the solution. "We've been doing some research, Dad, because we love you," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit compassion. "And we found this wonderful place. It's a resort, really. It's called Golden Meadows. They have round-the-clock care, activities, other people your age. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing ever again." She slid a glossy trifold brochure across the coffee table toward me. On the cover, a handsome, silver-haired couple was laughing, frozen in a moment of perfect joy on a pristine emerald green golf course. It was a beautiful, full-color lie. I picked it up. Golden Meadows, the name from the email, the pictures from the website. It was all happening exactly as their plan had laid out. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to react, to throw the table over, to tear that brochure into 1,000 pieces and throw it in their lying faces and roar that I knew everything. The rage was a living thing inside me, a wild animal clawing at the bars of its cage. But I couldn't. I had to play the long game. Arthur's voice echoed in my head, calm and steady. "Don't let them know that you know, Joel. Let them walk right into their own trap." I took a long, slow breath, trying to quiet the frantic drumming in my chest. I focused on the smell of the room, the scent of the dinner we'd just eaten, anything to anchor myself to the moment. I looked down at the brochure one more time, then gently pushed it back across the table. "Let me think about it," I said. My voice was so calm, so measured, it surprised even me. "This is a big decision." The reaction was immediate. They exchanged a quick, confused glance. This wasn't in their script. They had prepared for an argument. They had prepared for a tearful breakdown. They had not prepared for quiet, reasonable consideration. Their ambush had been met not with a counterattack, but with a calm deflection they didn't know how to handle. I used their confusion as my exit. I pushed myself up slowly from my chair. "I'm a little tired," I said, my voice still even. "I think I'm going to turn in for the night." I walked out of the room and up the stairs, feeling their bewildered eyes on my back the entire way. I had just withstood a direct, brutal assault on my mind and my spirit. And I had not broken. I had held the line. I closed my bedroom door behind me, leaned against it, and let out a long, shuddering breath. I had won the battle. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the war was far from over. The next hurdle in my secret operation came in the form of a phone call from Brenda. The buyers, as part of their due diligence, needed to schedule a full home inspection. It was a standard, necessary step, but for me, it was a logistical nightmare. The inspection would take at least 3 hours, maybe more. How could I get Eliza and Mason out of the house for that long on a weekday? Then I realized I could use their own twisted strategy against them. I could weaponize their fake concern. The next morning at breakfast, I put on a little performance. I moved a bit slower than usual. I let out a soft groan as I sat down at the table. I rubbed my chest a little. "Dad, are you okay?" Eliza asked, her eyes narrowing with what I'm sure she thought looked like concern, but I recognized as sharp, predatory interest. "I'm just feeling a little off," I said, letting a slight waver into my voice. "A little weak. Maybe I should think about getting a checkup." It was like throwing a steak to a couple of hungry wolves. They both pounced on the opportunity. "Oh, Dad, you should. We've been saying so," Eliza said, a little too eagerly. "I can take you. I'll call Dr. Evans right now." I could see the wheels turning in her head. Their chance to get me in a room with a doctor, to plant the seeds of my supposed incompetence, to get that golden ticket signature they needed for their plan. No, that's all right," I said, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't want to be a bother. Tell you what, though, maybe you could do me a favor. I've heard about some of those new high-potency vitamins. The expensive kind. There's a big pharmacy over on the other side of town that supposedly has the best selection. Maybe you and Mason could go pick some up for me. Get the best ones they have, don't worry about the cost." They readily agreed, happy to be seen as dutiful, caring daughters, and no doubt thrilled at the thought of me getting weaker, more dependent. They didn't realize I was sending them on a wild goose chase that would buy me the 3-hour window I so desperately needed. The home inspector was a man about my age named Frank. He had a firm handshake, calloused hands, and the no-nonsense air of a man who had spent his life looking at how things were put together. For the next 3 hours, he was a ghost in my house, his footsteps echoing from the basement to the attic. I heard him running faucets, testing outlets, tapping on walls. At one point, I saw him up on the roof, walking the ridgeline with the easy confidence of a man who knows his business. Finally, he came down, wiping a layer of dust from his hands onto his work pants. "Well, Mr. Ward," he said, looking at me with a level, appraising gaze, "I've inspected a lot of houses in this neighborhood. Most of them have been flipped and patched over with cheap fixes, not this one." He gave a firm nod. "You've taken good care of this place. The foundation is rock solid, the electrical is clean, the plumbing is sound. They don't build them this solid anymore." The honest, professional praise from a stranger, a fellow craftsman, felt like a balm on a wound I didn't know was still so raw. His words were a direct antidote to the poison my daughters had been whispering. He didn't see a confused old man. He saw a competent caretaker, a man whose life's work was sound and true. After Frank left and the house was quiet again, I began a crucial task. I went into my small office and pulled out a stack of empty cardboard boxes. I wasn't packing furniture or dishes. I was packing my life. I carefully wrapped my 30-year service medal from the fire department, its weight heavy with memories. I went through a shoebox of old photographs of Sarah, selecting a handful of my favorites. And I found the small, folded-up drawings Eliza had made for me as a little girl, the ones of me as a hero in front of a fire truck that I had secretly kept all these years. Each item was a piece of a life that could not be appraised, a memory that had no price tag. I sealed each box with packing tape, writing in thick black marker on the side. Personal. Then, one by one, I carried my true inheritance out to my truck, hiding it under an old dusty tarp in the back. As I was carrying the last box, my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who had lived next door since the day we moved in, was walking by. "Spring cleaning, Joel?" she asked with a warm, friendly smile. I nearly jumped, startled. "Oh, something like that, Martha. Just getting rid of some old things." She paused, her smile softening into something kind and knowing. "Well, whatever you're up to, I just wanted to tell you something I've been meaning to say for years. You're the best neighbor a person could ask for. Having you here all this time, I've always felt safe." Another confirmation. Another voice from the outside world reminding me of who I really was. I wasn't a burden. I was a fixture of the community, a source of security. The final appointment was at Arthur Weinberg's quiet wood-paneled office. Brenda was there, and the final transfer documents were laid out on the massive oak desk. Arthur went over every clause, every line item, making sure I understood. When he was done, he pushed the final signature page toward me. As I signed my name for the last time as the owner of that house, I felt a profound sense of serenity. It was done. The house officially had a new owner. The money would be transferred to my secret trust account within a few days. "You were very brave, Mr. Ward," Arthur said, shaking my hand. I just nodded. This wasn't bravery. It was necessity. On the way back, I didn't take the usual route home. I drove to a different part of town. I found the small, clean apartment complex I'd seen online. It was near a park and a public library. I pulled my truck over to the curb across the street and just looked at it for a long time. It wasn't a big house. It didn't have a yard Sarah had tended or a garage full of memories. But it was mine. It was a place where no one could ever call me a burden again. It was a place that was safe. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt like I was looking at the starting line of a whole new life. It happened on a Saturday morning. I was in the garage, oiling the chain on an old handsaw, finding a small measure of peace in the simple, honest work. The house was quiet. Eliza and Mason had gone to the big supermarket across town, a trip that always took them a couple of hours. That's when the doorbell rang. The sound, sharp and unexpected, cut through the calm. I wasn't expecting anyone. My secret life ran through the burner phone, and my public life was, by design, uneventful. Wiping the grease from my hands onto a red rag, I walked through the house to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize, looking flustered and tired. He was wearing a polo shirt with some kind of corporate logo on it. I opened the door. "Good morning," he said, shifting a clipboard from one hand to the other. "I'm looking for a Mr. and Mrs. Miller. Does a Miller live at this address?" Miller. Mason's married name. My internal alarms, honed by weeks of vigilance, went on high alert. "They're not here right now," I said, my voice neutral. The man let out a long, weary sigh, the sigh of a man who has the worst job in the world. "Well, we've sent multiple notices by mail, but we've had no response. This is the final attempt before we proceed." He held out a bright red envelope. Stamped across the front in thick black aggressive letters were the words, "Urgent. Final notice of asset repossession." My blood ran cold. I kept my face a perfect blank. "Repossession of what?" I asked, my voice steady. "The BMW," the man said, gesturing vaguely toward the driveway where the car usually sat. "The one registered to Mason Miller. The account is 6 months past due." 6 months. The two words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The timeline clicked into place with sickening precision. 6 months ago was right around the time they had started their campaign of kindness. The sudden concern for my health, the offers to cook dinner, the sweet inquiries about how I was feeling. It all started 6 months ago. The pieces of the puzzle didn't just fit. They locked together, forming a clear and ugly picture. I reached out and took the letter from him. My hand was steady. "I'll make sure they get it," I said. The man just nodded, relieved to be done with his unpleasant task, and walked back to his car. I closed the door, my back resting against the solid wood, and looked down at the red envelope in my hand. It felt as hot as a burning coal. So this was it. This was the why. The fake kindness, the gaslighting, the elaborate and cruel plan to put me in a home. It wasn't just born of greed. It was born of sheer, suffocating desperation. They were drowning in debt. The fancy car in the driveway, the expensive clothes, the constant stream of packages from online stores. It was all a performance. A pathetic stage play funded by loans they had no way to pay back. They weren't just flawed, they were frauds. A strange thing happened then. I waited for the surge of satisfaction, of vindication. I waited for that triumphant feeling of I knew it. But it never came. Instead, as I stood there in the quiet hallway, I was filled with a profound and heavy sadness. A sadness for their utter, spectacular foolishness. They could have come to me. They could have sat me down and told me they were in trouble. I would have been angry, disappointed, sure. But I am Eliza's father. I would not have let my daughter and her husband get their car taken away to be humiliated like that. We would have fought. We would have figured it out. I would have helped them. But they didn't choose that path. They didn't choose honesty. They chose deception. They chose to look at their father, the man who had raised them and provided for them his entire life, and see not a lifeline, but a liquidation opportunity. They chose to see me as a financial solution, not a father. And that was a betrayal so deep, it made the simple matter of money seem trivial. I waited. I put the red envelope on the hall table and went back to my garage. An hour later, they came home, laughing and talking, their arms full of grocery bags. I watched them from the doorway as they put things away, completely oblivious. I stayed silent. I let them settle in. I waited until they were both sitting in the living room, scrolling through their phones, surrounded by the comfort and security they believed was theirs by right. Then, I walked out of the kitchen. I picked up the red envelope from the table. I walked over to the coffee table and, without a word, the bright red against the dark wood was impossible to ignore. "Someone was looking for you," I said, my voice quiet and even. Then I turned and walked back toward the kitchen. I heard the frantic tearing of paper. And then, a silence. A deep, deafening, deathly silence that consumed the entire room, sucking all the air out of the house. I didn't need to be in there to see their faces. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their panicked whispers. That suffocating silence was their confession. It was their plea of guilty. I stood at the kitchen sink, gripping the edge, and I knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the foundation of the house itself, that the power dynamic in this home had just shifted, permanently. I was no longer the confused old man who needed to be cared for. I was the one who knew the truth. That red envelope wasn't just a notice of a debt. It was a witness, a silent, unimpeachable witness to their lies, their desperation, and their betrayal. And it was the final, absolute validation for the path I had chosen. After the incident with the red letter, the house fell into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the dead, heavy silence of a cold war. The charade was over. Eliza and Mason no longer bothered with their fake smiles or their hollow offers of concern. They moved around me with a sullen resentment, avoiding my gaze, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary. Mealtimes became an exercise in silent torture. The only sounds were the scrape of a fork on a plate, the clink of a glass set down too hard. The air was thick with their unspoken accusations and my unspoken truth. I could feel their desperation radiating off them in waves. They were in a race against time, trying to cash in their inheritance before their world collapsed. They just didn't know the race was already over, and they had already lost. Their desperation soon curdled into impatience, and they began to apply pressure. The subtlety was gone, replaced by a blunt, irritable persistence. "Have you thought any more about Golden Meadows, Dad?" Eliza would ask, her voice edged with a new sharpness. She'd ask me in the morning, then again in the afternoon. "They can't hold that spot for us forever, you know." Mason took a different approach, the martyr. She would let out long, theatrical sighs whenever I was in the room. "God If only we had a large sum of money right now, she'd say to no one in particular while looking directly at me. Everything would be so much easier. They were trying to bludgeon me with guilt, to make me feel responsible for the financial prison they had built for themselves. The pressure from inside the house was immense, but a call from the outside world brought a new kind of urgency. It was Brenda, on the burner phone. "Good news, Mr. Ward," she said, her voice professional and cheerful. "The buyer's financing is approved, and we've set the closing date." My grip on the phone tightened. "When?" I asked. "Next Friday," she said. "1 week from tomorrow. The new family is so excited. They drove past the house again yesterday, just to look at the oak tree in the backyard." A week. Just 7 days. The news was a jolt of both relief and pure, high-voltage stress. The finish line was in sight, but the ticking of the clock suddenly grew deafeningly loud. I hung up the phone and looked through the window into the kitchen. Eliza and Mason were huddled in the corner, arguing in hushed, angry whispers about something on a laptop. They were plotting and scheming, completely unaware that they were standing on ground that would no longer be theirs in 7 days. They were fighting over a kingdom that had already been sold. A couple of days later, the quiet war escalated. I was dozing in my recliner in the living room, or at least they thought I was. I had learned to keep my breathing deep and even, to listen from behind a mask of sleep. I heard Eliza on her cell phone in the entryway, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Yes, doctor, thank you for calling back," she said, her voice syrupy with fake concern. "It's my father. He's just gotten so confused lately, and he's very frail. We're terribly worried he's a danger to himself. I was wondering, would it be possible for you to make a house call? He refuses to go in for an appointment, and we think we might need a formal assessment of his condition for future arrangements." My heart stopped. This was it. They were making their move. They were actively trying to get a doctor to declare me incompetent, to get the signature they needed to take legal control. The threat was no longer a line in an email. It was a phone call happening 20 feet away. A wave of pure, hot panic surged through me. My first instinct was to sit bolt upright, to confront her, to scream. But then, Arthur's calm, steady voice echoed in my memory. "If they call a doctor, Joel, you stay calm. You answer his questions clearly and honestly. You have nothing to hide. You are of sound mind." I forced the panic down, my jaw clenched. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even. But the bitterness of it all was like acid in my throat. The humiliation of having to prove my own sanity to a stranger, all because my own child was trying to steal it from me. The last night came. The final day of the sale was tomorrow. I had already signed a lease on a small, clean apartment, and my move-in date was the day after tomorrow. My whole life, the real parts anyway, was packed in those cardboard boxes, waiting silently in the bed of my truck. I couldn't sleep that night. The silence in the house was different. It felt final. Around 2 a.m, I got up and walked downstairs. I moved through the dark, moonlit rooms like a ghost, saying my own goodbyes. I ran my hand over the worn, familiar fabric of my recliner. I brushed my fingers over the cool, silent keys of Sarah's piano. I stood in the center of the living room and just listened to the old house breathe around me one last time. This was the last night. Tomorrow the sale would be finalized. The money would be transferred. And soon, very soon, all the secrets would come tumbling out into the light. I had no idea what that chaos would look like, what they would do, what they would say. But standing there, in the quiet darkness of my home for the last time, I knew one thing for sure. I was ready. The morning of the closing, the sky was a sharp, brilliant, and almost cruelly beautiful blue. I woke up before the sun, the way I always do, and made a pot of coffee. The house was still, wrapped in that deep, pre-dawn quiet. Eliza and Mason were still asleep upstairs. This particular silence felt different, heavier. It was the calm you feel in the air moments before a storm breaks. I knew that today was the day the new family was scheduled for the final walkthrough and to receive the keys. Brenda had arranged it all for 10 o'clock sharp, coordinating with a representative from the title company. The system, as I'd come to think of it, was now fully in motion. It was a great, impartial machine of contracts and legal statutes, a machine that couldn't be swayed by crocodile tears or manipulated by lies. My daughter's desperate little schemes were about to collide with a force they couldn't even comprehend. When they finally came downstairs, I was ready for them. I had my story rehearsed, my expression carefully neutral. "Morning," I said, looking up from the newspaper. "I've got an appointment with Arthur, my lawyer, this morning. Just going over some of the will and estate paperwork. It'll probably take me all morning." I watched their faces closely. They exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. It was a look of pure, triumphant victory. In their minds, this was it. The old man was finally surrendering. He was going to his lawyer to arrange the orderly transfer of his assets into their waiting hands. The final piece of their plan was falling into place. "Oh, that's great, Dad," Eliza said, her fake smile returning in full force, brighter and more sickening than ever. "That's so responsible of you. You just take all the time you need. Don't you worry about a thing here. We'll hold down the fort." "Yeah, Dad," Mason added, her voice full of false sincerity. "Whatever you need, just give us a call." I just nodded, folded my newspaper, and finished my coffee. The bitter irony of their words was a taste I had grown accustomed to. I got in my truck and pulled out of the driveway, but I didn't go far. I drove to the end of the street to a spot where I could park with a clear view of the house. I was a general, watching the battlefield from a safe distance. Just before 10, I saw Brenda's familiar sedan pull up to the curb. A few moments later, another nondescript car arrived, the title agent. And then, right on time, a blue minivan pulled in behind them. The new family? The doors slid open and they all piled out. The husband, the wife, the doctor, and the teacher, and their 2 small children, a boy who looked about 8 and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. The kids were practically vibrating with excitement. I watched the husband put his arm around his wife's shoulder as they stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the house. The look on their faces was one of pure, unadulterated hope. They were standing on the threshold of their dream. From my vantage point, I played out the scene in my head. I pictured the doorbell ringing. I could imagine Eliza and Mason's confusion, expecting no one. I saw them opening the door to find Brenda, smiling professionally, with a small group of strangers behind her. "Good morning," I could hear Brenda saying in my mind, her voice polite but firm. "My name is Brenda Thompson. We're here for the final walkthrough and key handover for the new owners." I pictured the looks on my daughter's faces. First, the blank confusion. Then, the dawning, horrified disbelief. And finally, the inevitable explosion of rage. "New owners? What are you talking about? This is our father's house. There must be some kind of mistake. Of course they would protest. They would yell. They would threaten to call the police. They would call it a scam, a mistake, anything but the truth. But their emotional, chaotic outburst would be met with the calm, implacable force of the system. I could see the title agent, a man they'd never met, stepping forward. He wouldn't argue. He would simply open a leather-bound folder. He would present a sheaf of documents filled with official seals and notarized signatures. The sales contract, the new deed of title, the transfer of funds receipt, black ink on white paper. The system doesn't care about whispered plots or secret entitlements. It doesn't care about what you think you deserve. It only cares about what is written, what is signed, what is legal. And on paper, the house was no longer mine. And it had certainly never been theirs. Their entire fantasy, their entire future, would be dismantled right there on the front porch by a few pieces of paper and a man just doing his job. I watched as Brenda, after a few minutes of what looked like a tense conversation, finally led the young family up the walkway and through the front door. I didn't need to be there to witness the meltdown. I didn't need to hear the accusations or see the tears of rage. My story with that house was over. It ended the moment my pen signed the final contract. Today was just a formality. I turned the key in the ignition, and the old truck rumbled to life. As that young family was beginning the first chapter of their new life in my old home, the chapter my daughters had planned for themselves was being slammed shut, finally and forever. I didn't turn in the direction of the lawyer's office. I pulled out onto the main road and drove toward my new apartment, toward my future. I was in my new apartment, on my knees, in the middle of a battle with a flat-pack bookshelf and a set of instructions that seemed to be written in a foreign language. There was a simple, honest frustration to it that felt good, normal. The afternoon sun streamed through the clean new windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The place smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. This small, empty space was quiet, and it was slowly starting to feel like mine. That's when the burner phone rang. Its shrill, unfamiliar ringtone was a violent intrusion into the peaceful afternoon. It was an unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let this last, toxic tether to my old life just fade into nothing. But a stronger impulse took over, a need for true and final closure. True freedom isn't about running away from a loose end. It's about facing it, tying it off, and cutting it for good. I wiped my hands on my jeans, took a breath, and answered. Hello? A pause on the other end, filled only by a ragged, desperate sound of someone trying to catch their breath. Then, a voice I knew, but a version of it I had never heard before, a voice that was shattered, stripped of all its condescending confidence and manipulative sweetness. Dad? It's me. It was Eliza. All the sharp edges were gone. All that was left was the raw, frayed sound of utter panic. How could you do this to us? She finally managed to get out, the words tumbling over each other in a choked sob. How could you sell the house and not say a single word? Dad, do you have any idea where we are right now? We're standing on the sidewalk. The new owners showed up with a police officer and made us leave. Our things are on the front lawn for the whole world to see. All the neighbors are staring. How could you be so cruel? She went on and on, a torrent of accusations, each sentence designed to paint me as the villain, the monster who had thrown his own children out onto the street. As I listened to her hysterical tirade, a strange sense of detachment washed over me. I noted with a clinical coldness how her every instinct was to assign blame, to cast herself as the victim of my actions, not the architect of her own ruin. She was describing the consequences as if they had fallen from the sky, with no connection to the choices that led her to this exact moment. I let her exhaust herself, let the storm of her blame run out of wind, until all that was left were pathetic, shuddering sobs. When the silence finally came, I spoke, my voice softer and calmer than I'd ever heard it. Eliza, that was my house. I had the right to do with it as I pleased. But it was our home. It was supposed to be our inheritance, she shrieked, a fresh wave of fury in her voice. No, I said, and my voice was still quiet, but it was as solid and unyielding as the foundation of that house. The inheritance your mother and I worked our whole lives to leave for you wasn't a building. It was a set of values, a moral compass. We taught you about honesty, about hard work, about having enough self-respect to stand on your own 2 feet. The house was just the place where those lessons were taught. You chose to burn down the schoolhouse, Eliza. Don't blame me for the ashes. Another silence stretched across the line, this one thick with shock. I could hear the faint, frantic sound of Mason whispering to her in the background, their panic now turning to a different kind of desperation. The attack hadn't worked. The accusations had bounced right off me. It was time for a new tactic. When Eliza spoke again, her voice had completely transformed. It was small, wheedling, and pathetic. It was the voice of a beggar. Dad, we were wrong, okay? We were so wrong. I'm sorry. We're so sorry. But please, you have to help us. Just this one last time. You still have all that money from the sale, right? You could just give us a little, just enough to get an apartment, to get back on our feet, to get a new start. Please, Dad. You wouldn't just leave us with nothing. You're my father. You're my father. The irony of her using those words now as a last-ditch tool of manipulation, after she had worked so hard to reduce that title to nothing more than a barrier to her inheritance, was staggering. I took a long, slow breath, looking around at the quiet, sunlit room that was now my sanctuary. Yes, Eliza. "I am your father," I said, and the words were heavy with a sad, painful clarity. "And because I am your father, I am going to give you one last lesson. It's the lesson you should have learned a long time ago. It's about responsibility." I could hear her holding her breath on the other end, waiting. "Your lives, your choices, the car you couldn't afford, the debts you've racked up, all of it. That is your responsibility, not mine. Giving you more money now wouldn't be a kindness, Eliza. It would be a poison. It would just teach you that the consequences are for other people. It would rob you of the only chance you have to finally grow up. And as your father, I refuse to do that to you. This is the last, and maybe the most important thing I can do for you." I felt a final, painful snap inside my chest. It was the sound of a rotten cord stretched thin for years, finally breaking for good. "Dad, please," she started, her voice cracking into a desperate whine, the beginning of a new round of begging. But I interrupted her. My war was over. The negotiations were done. "I have to go now, Eliza," I said, my voice gentle but absolute. "Good luck." And then I ended the call. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't slam it down. I just carefully placed the small, cheap piece of plastic on the half-finished bookshelf beside me. The silence of my little apartment rushed back in to fill the space. There were no more accusations, no more lies, no more pleading. There was only peace, a deep, quiet, and profound peace that I had fought for and won. I walked to the window and looked out at nothing in particular, just the brick of the building next door, and a small patch of blue sky. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt truly, completely free. A few days after the phone call, I was in my new apartment, in the process of hanging the old silver-framed photo of Sarah and me on a freshly painted wall. I was feeling a quiet sense of purpose, of building something new, however small. That's when the pounding started. It wasn't a polite, neighborly knock. It was a frantic, angry, demanding fist hammering on my door, a sound of pure entitlement that didn't belong in the quiet peace of my new life. But I wasn't surprised. I knew, sooner or later, they would find me. I set the picture frame down gently, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. There they were, Eliza and Mason, their faces distorted and monstrous through the fisheye lens. They looked terrible, truly, deeply pathetic. Their clothes were wrinkled and slept in. There were dark, hollowed-out circles under their eyes from a lack of sleep and a surplus of stress. The arrogant confidence they always wore as a second skin was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged desperation. This was the public face of their private failure. I took one last, steadying breath, a silent preparation for the final act, and opened the door. "Dad," Eliza said, her voice a harsh rasp, "we need to talk." They didn't wait for an invitation. They brushed past me into the small apartment, their aggressive energy immediately seeming to shrink the space, to contaminate my quiet sanctuary. They looked around, their faces twisting with undisguised contempt at the modest, clean room. "This is where you're living?" Mason blurted out, a sneer in her voice. "You get nearly $1 million from our house, and you're living in this box?" Eliza was more direct. She planted herself in the middle of my small living room, her hands on her hips, a posture I knew meant she was preparing for a fight. "Where is it, Dad?" she demanded, her voice rising. "The money. Where is the money from the house? What did you do with it? You can't just keep it all for yourself. That's family money. It's for our future, our security. It's ours." They still didn't get it. After everything, after all their lies and manipulations had been brought to ruin, their sense of entitlement was still stubbornly, blindly intact. They truly believed they had a right to the fruits of my life's labor. I didn't answer right away. I calmly turned my back on them, an act of dismissal so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. I walked the few steps to my new small kitchen, took a glass from the cabinet, and filled it with water from the tap. The sound of the running water was the only sound in the room, a steady, peaceful sound that amplified the tense, ragged silence of their breathing. This was my space, my home, my stage, and I was in complete control. "Are you even listening to me?" Eliza finally shrieked, her voice cracking with the strain of her impatience. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, then turned to face them. I looked directly into their eyes, my gaze calm and as unyielding as old iron. "I'm listening," I said, my voice perfectly even. "And I also listened, Eliza. I listened that night, through a cracked bedroom door when you were planning my future for me. I heard everything you said, about me being a burden, about that lovely resort, Golden Meadows. I heard you talk about how much easier everything would be if you just had a doctor's note saying I was no longer of sound mind. The transformation was immediate, and it was absolute. It was like watching a building's facade crumble away in an instant. The color drained from both of their faces. The self-righteous anger vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed, slack-jawed panic. The hunters had just realized they were the ones in the cage. They never, in their wildest, most arrogant dreams, imagined that I knew their secret. "That money," I continued, my voice still quiet, never rising. "Yes, it's nearly $1 million, and it's sitting safely in a professionally managed trust account at a bank you've never heard of. It's going to pay the rent on this box, as you call it, for the rest of my life. It's going to pay for my groceries, my bills, and if the day ever comes when I actually do need medical care, it will pay for that too. That's what responsible adults do, girls. They provide for their own futures. I'm going to make sure with my own money that I am never a burden to anyone, least of all to you." Every calm, factual word I spoke was a hammer blow, systematically shattering the last desperate remnants of their greedy hopes. I looked at Eliza, at the daughter whose childhood drawings I still kept in a box, a relic from a different lifetime. "You chose your path, Eliza," I said, and for the first time a trace of a deep, profound weariness entered my voice. "You wanted me to disappear from your sophisticated lives. You wanted the burden gone. Well, I've done what you asked. I've disappeared, and I took my financial burden with me. I walked to the door and opened it wide, letting the quiet hallway air into my apartment. Now it's time for you to leave," I said. "This is my home, my sanctuary, and you are not welcome here." Mason looked like she was about to start crying, to offer some last, pathetic protest. But Eliza just stared at me, her face a blank mask. She grabbed her sister's arm, her grip tight. And for the first time in this whole miserable affair, I looked into my daughter's eyes and I didn't see greed or anger or entitlement. I just saw a vast, hollow emptiness, the emptiness of a soul that had gambled everything on a single selfish plan and lost, only to realize there was nothing left inside. They walked out without another word, their shoulders slumped in a final, irreversible defeat. I watched them go down the hall, their angry, energetic entrance replaced by a silent, shuffling exit. I watched them until they turned the corner, and then I gently closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was loud in the quiet apartment. It was a solid, decisive, and final sound. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, and waited for a feeling of triumph, of glee, of righteous satisfaction. But none of it came. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel vengeful. I just felt peace. A deep, quiet, all-encompassing peace. The fire was out. The old house, the old life, had burned to the ground. Some fires are fought with water and axes, and others are fought with silence and patience. And from the ashes of that fire, I had managed to rescue the only thing that was truly, irreplaceably valuable: myself. A few months passed. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, my new life began to find its own quiet, steady rhythm. I'd wake up in the morning not to a feeling of dread, but to the warm, unfiltered sunlight streaming through the window of my small apartment, a sight I was starting to cherish. I'd make myself a pot of coffee, the way I liked it, strong and black, and sit by the window to read the paper. The silence in the apartment was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of my old house, which had always felt thick with unspoken tensions and simmering resentments. This silence was a friend. It was a peaceful, expansive quiet, a blank canvas on which I could paint my own day. I no longer heard the footsteps of predators overhead. The only sounds were the distant, cheerful shouts of children playing in the nearby park and the song of birds in the trees just outside my window. Every now and then, a letter would arrive, tucked in with my bills and junk mail. The envelope was always handwritten, the elegant looping script instantly recognizable as Eliza's. There was never a return address, a small, cowardly omission that spoke volumes. The first time it happened, I held the letter in my hand for a long time, feeling its physical weight. For a fleeting second, a foolish, fatherly instinct flickered, a hope that perhaps there was real remorse inside, a genuine change of heart. But then the cold, hard memory of their calculated cruelty washed that hope away. I knew what was likely inside. Maybe it was a desperate, tear-stained apology aimed at my wallet. Maybe it was a new set of accusations, a new attempt to blame me for her circumstances. I didn't know for sure, and I realized with a clarity that felt like a cool drink of water that I didn't want to know. My peace was too new, too precious, too hard-won to risk poisoning it with her words, whatever they were. Forgiveness, I thought, might be possible someday, in the quiet of my own heart, as a gift I give myself. But forgetting is a different thing altogether. And trust, once it's been shattered into a million pieces, can never be truly glued back together. I walked to the small kitchen, opened the lid of the trash can, and simply let the letter drop inside. I was protecting my new home. I met Dave for breakfast at our old spot, the Blue Plate Diner. He watched me as I slid into the booth, a slow, appraising smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, squinting at me over the top of his coffee mug. "You look different, Joel. Lighter, somehow." I returned his smile, a genuine one that reached my eyes. "Just did some cleaning out, Dave. Got rid of some old junk that had been weighing the place down." He just nodded, that deep, quiet understanding that had defined our friendship for 30 years passing between us. He knew I wasn't talking about old furniture. We sat there for over an hour, talking about the things old men talk about. We talked about the best kind of lure for bass fishing down at the reservoir, about the coming winter, about the familiar aches and pains in our backs and knees. He told me a story about his youngest grandchild learning to ride a bike. I never told him the whole sordid tale of the house and the money. I didn't need to. All he needed to see was that his friend, who had been carrying a heavy, invisible weight for a long time, was finally okay. Sometimes, that's all a friendship needs. One afternoon, I found myself back in Arthur Weinberg's quiet, wood-paneled office. "I want to do something, Arthur," I said. It was far more than a single old man would ever need. It felt heavy, a burden of a different kind, a responsibility. I knew I couldn't just let it sit there, and I knew with a sudden certainty what Sarah would have wanted. I remembered her telling me stories about the nurses who had cared for her with such kindness in her final days. "They're angels, Joel," she'd said. "Absolute angels." So I told Arthur my plan. I wanted to take a substantial portion of the money and use it to establish a small, permanent scholarship fund at the local community college. The Sarah Ward Memorial Scholarship, I'd call it. It would be for students from low-income families who wanted to go into nursing. As I sat there, signing the final documents to create the fund, a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy washed over me. This signature was different from the others. Signing the real estate contract had been an act of desperate self-defense. Signing the closing papers had been a final, necessary procedure. But this signature, this was an act of creation. This, I realized, was a true legacy. Not a house with 4 walls and a roof. Not a number in a bank account. A legacy is the help you give that continues to grow after you're gone. It's the kindness you plant in the world that blossoms in places you'll never even see. In their selfish, desperate attempt to steal my material inheritance, Eliza and Mason had inadvertently pushed me to discover a far greater one. A legacy that would actually make a difference, a legacy that would truly honor their mother's beautiful, compassionate memory. Later that evening, I took a walk to the park near my apartment. I found an empty bench and sat down, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. A group of kids were laughing, chasing a soccer ball across the grass. A young couple walked by, holding hands. My life was simple now, but it felt full. I didn't have a big house, but I had a home. I didn't have my children by my side, but I was not lonely. I realized then that the final verdict of my story wasn't what happened to Eliza and Mason. Their story was their own to write now. The final verdict was the choice I had made for myself: to live the remainder of my days with peace in my heart and my dignity intact. It wasn't about winning a fight against them. It was about achieving a state of grace within myself. And for me, sitting on that park bench as the day came to a close, that was a complete and total victory. You know, sometimes you have to tear something old down to build a better future. It's never too late to start a new chapter, to find a new purpose. Have any of you ever had to make a big, life-altering change when you were no longer young? I'd be honored to hear your story in the comments. The very first thing I did in my new apartment wasn't unpacking the boxes I'd so carefully curated. The rooms were clean, empty, and they echoed with a profound silence. Before this new place could start to feel like a home, I knew I needed to establish an anchor, a new command post. So the first thing I did was go out and buy a chair. I didn't look for a big, plush, lazy boy like my old one. That throne belonged to a different kingdom, to a life that was over. I was a different man now, in a different place. I spent a whole afternoon at a furniture store, and I chose a simple, handsome armchair. It was smaller than my old one, upholstered in a dark brown leather that felt sturdy and honest to the touch. It wasn't a chair for sinking and sleeping into. It was a chair for sitting, for reading, for observing. When the delivery men brought it up, I had them place it right next to the big window in the living room, the one that looked out over the park. This was my new spot, the place where I would drink my morning coffee and watch the world wake up. It wasn't a replacement for my old life. It was the first piece of a new one. In those first few days, the silence was the hardest part. It was a physical presence in the apartment, a vast emptiness that I wasn't used to. For 40 years, my life had a soundtrack: the constant hum of the television, the sound of footsteps on the floorboards upstairs, the noise of other people's lives. One afternoon, just to get out of the apartment, I was walking through my new neighborhood and passed by a dusty little second-hand shop. Tucked in the back, I saw an old turntable, a record player with a warm wooden case. Instantly, I thought of Sarah. She had loved jazz. On quiet evenings, she used to put on her old records, and the sound of Louis Armstrong's trumpet or Ella Fitzgerald's voice would fill the house. On impulse, I bought the turntable and a small stack of old jazz records. That night, back in my apartment, I set it up. I put on a record, and after a moment of soft crackling, the warm, soulful sound of a saxophone filled the room. The music didn't make the silence go away. It just gave it a beautiful, gentle rhythm. It made the quiet feel like a choice. A few days after that, I started making phone calls. I dug out my old address book and started going down the list of my friends from the firehouse, guys I hadn't spoken to in months. I was hesitant at first, afraid they'd ask questions I didn't want to answer, but I pushed through the discomfort. I wasn't calling to unload my problems or look for pity. I was just calling to check in. "Hey Dave, it's Joel. How you been? Frank, you get that boat out on the lake this year?" The conversations were short, easy, full of the kind of good-natured ribbing that defined our friendship. We talked about fishing, about bad knees, about the good old days, and with each call, I felt another piece of myself coming back into focus. These calls were like anchor lines, pulling me back to the world, reminding me that I wasn't just a betrayed father or a lonely old man. I was a friend, a colleague, a brother. My apartment had a small concrete balcony, nothing more than a little ledge overlooking the street. It wasn't the big green backyard Sarah and I had tended for decades, but it was mine. I took a trip to the local Home Depot, the cavernous store smelling of cut lumber and fertilizer. I bought a few large terracotta pots, bags of soil, and a handful of seed packets. Back on my balcony, I spent an entire afternoon creating a small container garden. I planted cherry tomatoes, fragrant basil, and some resilient-looking marigolds. There's a healing power in caring for something, in getting your hands dirty and tending to a living thing, watching it grow day by day because of your efforts. I no longer had a sprawling lawn to mow, but I could still create life, even if it was just in a few small pots of earth. I've never been much of a cook. That was always Sarah's domain. She moved around a kitchen with an effortless grace that I could only admire. But now, it was just me. I had to learn to fend for myself. One evening, determined not to eat another frozen dinner, I went online and found a simple recipe for spaghetti with a fresh tomato sauce. I went to the grocery store and took my time, picking out the reddest tomatoes, a head of garlic, a fresh bunch of basil from my tiny garden. That night, I put on my new Louis Armstrong record, poured myself a glass of water, and started cooking. I followed the directions carefully, humming along to the music as the kitchen filled with the rich, wonderful smell of simmering garlic and tomatoes. The final dish wasn't perfect. The sauce was a little thin, maybe, but it was mine. I had made it, from start to finish. And as I sat at my small table, listening to the jazz, I took the first bite, and it tasted absolutely delicious. A few weeks into this new life, I woke up one morning. I made my coffee and sat down in my new armchair, looking out the window at the park, and a realization washed over me with the force of a quiet tidal wave. I could do anything I wanted today. I could eat breakfast at 10. I could take a walk and not come back until dusk. I could sit here and read a book all day long. There was no one to please, no one's schedule to accommodate, no one to worry about or be worried by. This absolute, total freedom. At first, it was a little bit scary. The sheer openness of it was dizzying. But then, a slow smile spread across my face. I realized that this feeling, this quiet, simple, and profound right to be the sole author of my own days, this was what I had been fighting for all along. The call that changed the trajectory of my new life came from Arthur Weinberg, my lawyer. I was sitting in my command post, my new armchair, just watching the afternoon turn to gold in the park across the street, when the phone rang. "Joel, it's Arthur. How are you settling in?" he asked, his voice as warm and steady as ever. We made small talk for a minute, and then he got to the real reason for his call. "Listen, Joel, I'm calling to ask for a favor, and please feel free to say no. I volunteer some time at the local community center, helping to run a support group. It's for seniors who are dealing with difficult family situations, specifically legal and financial abuse." He paused. "These are good people, but they're scared. They're isolated. They come to my office every day, broken by this stuff, and every single one of them thinks they're the only person in the world this has ever happened to. I was wondering, would you be willing to come and just share your story?" My blood ran cold. The thought of it was terrifying. To stand up in front of a room full of strangers and recount the most humiliating and painful chapter of my life felt like volunteering to have an old wound ripped open in public. My story was my own, a private, ugly thing I was still learning to live with. I didn't want their pity. I didn't want to be a spectacle. "Arthur, I appreciate you thinking of me," I said, my voice tight, "but I'm not a public speaker. I wouldn't know what to say." "I understand," he said, his voice gentle, "but you don't have to give a speech. You don't have to perform. All you have to do is tell the truth. Just tell them your story, exactly the way you told it to me that first day in my office." I ended the call politely, but with a firm no. Yet his request lingered. It followed me around my quiet apartment all week. And then, one afternoon, as I was watering my little balcony garden, I remembered it. That first night. The profound, crushing loneliness I felt after overhearing my daughter's plan. The suffocating certainty that I was the only person in the world this had ever happened to, that I was utterly and completely alone in my misery. I remembered how that feeling had almost broken me, and I thought about that room full of people Arthur described, each one of them sitting in their own private version of that same loneliness. If my story, as painful as it was to tell, could build a bridge to just one of them, if it could make them feel 1 ounce less alone, then maybe it was worth it. I picked up the phone and called Arthur back. "Okay, Arthur," I said, and I could hear the slight tremor in my own voice. "I'll do it." The meeting room at the community center was simple, just a circle of mismatched folding chairs on a linoleum floor under fluorescent lights. There were about 10 or 12 people there, men and women, all around my age. As I came in and took a seat, I looked around at their faces. I had expected to see a room full of victims, of broken and defeated people. But that's not what I saw. I saw survivors. I saw the same quiet, steely resilience in their eyes that I was just beginning to recognize in my own reflection. Every line on their faces told a story of a life lived, of battles fought. Arthur introduced me simply. "This is my friend Joel. He has a story he'd like to share." I took a deep breath and began to speak. My voice was shaky at first. I didn't talk about the legal documents, the sale price of the house, or the details of the contracts. I talked about how it felt. I talked about the feeling of standing in a familiar hallway and hearing your name and the word house whispered like a dirty secret. I talked about the specific gut-wrenching feeling of being called a burden by the very same child you once carried on your shoulders. I asked the room, "Has anyone here ever been made to feel like a piece of furniture in your own home? Something that's just in the way?" I described the quiet humiliation of having to sneak around, of making secret phone calls, of lying about a dental appointment just to reclaim a piece of your own life. And as I spoke, I watched the faces around me. I saw a woman with kind eyes, tears silently streaming down her cheeks, and in her, I saw a reflection of my own pain. I saw a man in a faded flannel shirt clench his wife's hand, his knuckles white, and I recognized the same silent rage I had held inside for so long. With every head that nodded in understanding, with every shared look of recognition, the walls of my own isolation crumbled just a little bit more. I wasn't just telling a story, I was testifying to a shared truth. I was not alone. When I finished, there wasn't any applause. There was just a profound, understanding silence that was more powerful than any ovation. It was the sound of a dozen people processing a difficult truth, of feeling seen. Then an older gentleman across the circle cleared his throat. "Me too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My son." He did the same thing with the power of attorney. Then the woman who had been crying spoke up. "My daughter tells me I'm crazy when I ask where my pension check went." And then another, and another. One by one, like they had just been waiting for someone to light the first candle in a dark room, they began to share their own stories. I sat there and listened, and a profound realization washed over me. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a key, one that had unlocked the door for others to step out of their own silent prisons. My pain, once a source of shame and isolation, had been transformed into something else. It had become a torch, and in that small, simple room, surrounded by my fellow survivors, I had passed it on. So here we are. We've come to the end of my story. For the past little while, you've been sitting with me, through the dark times and the quiet victories, and as I sit here now, in my new armchair, my command post, looking out at the evening sky, I find myself thinking about where this all began. You know, when my own kids tried to tell me I was losing my mind, when they tried to convince me that my reality wasn't real, it was the loneliest feeling in the world. It was a cold, isolating fog. It got me thinking about how many of us have stories, important stories, that just get pushed aside, unheard. I know that a lot of times when us men, who've seen more than a few decades go by, get together, whether it's in the garage, a fishing boat, or the break room at the firehouse, the stories just start to flow. Stories of triumph, of failure, of lessons learned the hard way. Today, I wanted to open up a little, to turn this one-way street into a conversation. I'm hoping to hear some of your stories too. It's a strange new world we live in, with all this technology. And something as simple as a click, a like, a subscribe, or a share might seem like a small, meaningless thing to some folks. I get that. But let me tell you what it means to me, and to all the other quiet voices out there that need to be heard. Every single one of those clicks is like a light flicking on in a dark room. It's a signal that travels through the wires and the airwaves. It's a simple human way of saying, I see you, I hear you, you are not invisible, your story matters. And my friends, your stories matter. They matter more than you know. Your life, your experiences, the wisdom you've earned through decades of hard work and heartbreak and quiet joy, that is a legacy. It's the realest inheritance there is. And it's too valuable to be left in the dark. So now that I've told my story, what I'd like most in this world is to hear from you. Down in the comments section below, I'd be honored if you'd share a piece of your own story. It doesn't have to be some big dramatic tale like mine. The quiet stories are often the most powerful. Maybe ask yourself, was there a time you felt dismissed or unheard, only to be proven right in the end? Do you have a passion, a hobby that others might have called silly, but that brings you a deep sense of purpose? Or maybe just a small, quiet moment when you found your own strength, a time when you stood your ground, even when no one else was watching. Please, share your stories. You don't have to use your real name if you don't want to. I want you to know that I'll be sitting right here, in this chair, and I'll be reading them. I will carry them with me because your stories are important. This channel, WAWA Ages, was started with the simple idea of building a community, a place where us men, fathers, grandfathers, husbands, mentors, craftsmen, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad, without judgment. And hey, if you don't have anything heavy to share today, I understand that too. In that case, just tell me one small thing that made you smile this week. A good cup of coffee, a call from an old friend, the way the sun hit the trees this morning. Let's share that too. If you're watching this on your television or listening somewhere else, don't be afraid to pick up your phone and look up my channel, WAWA Ages. Hit that subscribe button. Join us. Let's build this place together, brick by brick, story by story. A digital front porch, a virtual workshop, a place where our life's work and our hard-won wisdom are not just remembered, but celebrated. A place where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you. Thank you for sitting with me today, for listening to an old fireman tell his tale. It means more than you know. You weren't just a listener. You were my witness. Take care of yourselves, and be good to each other.